Ross Greening, the armament specialist for the operation, encountered and resolved numerous challenges at Eglin. With Doolittle's consent, he directed that 2 wooden replica 50-caliber dummy weapons constructed from broomsticks be positioned at the extreme rear of the aircraft to mislead enemy aviators attacking from behind. These were painted black and extended somewhat beyond the actual 50-caliber machine weapon to enhance their visibility. Since the lower weapon turret operated poorly or not at all, the decision was made to eliminate it. Colonel Doolittle personally made this choice, stating, "A person could master the violin well enough for Carnegie Hall before learning to operate that device." Greening personally developed a simplified bombing sight for the B-25s that he named the Mark Twain. He noted that practical low-altitude bombing trials conducted at 1,500 feet demonstrated superior accuracy with this simplified sight compared to the Norden sight used by the same bombardiers. This not only allowed enhanced bombing precision but eliminated the risk of the highly classified Norden sight falling into enemy possession. Most gunners who had volunteered for the operation had never fired a 50-caliber weapon nor operated a power turret previously. Gunnery training was delayed due to the extensive work required on the turrets, giving the personnel little opportunity to familiarize themselves with their weapons under flight conditions. Valuable time was lost while armament staff worked desperately to make the turrets operational. By the training period's conclusion, most gunners had ground-fired their weapons on the range, bore-sighted them, and fired several bursts in flight. However, none had fired at a moving target. Reflecting on his Eglin training, one gunner observed, "I suppose I should have been concerned then, but I don't recall worrying about anything during those days. Somehow, I knew that if the boss considered things acceptable, we would emerge successfully." The boss, meanwhile, was occupied deciding, among other matters, what bomb types should be used for the raid. He was assisted by Colonel Max F. Schneider, an ordnance specialist and chemical warfare service personnel at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. While Doolittle and Captains Ross Greening and Ski York were engaged with their respective duties, other group officers were carrying out their assigned tasks. Captain Davy Jones was responsible for obtaining maps, photographs, target charts, target folders, and weather records from the intelligence section in Washington. Lieutenant Trav Hoover worked continuously checking supplies and obtaining spare parts and equipment. Lieutenant Bill Bauer spent all his waking hours on the flight line supervising maintenance crews when not in the cockpit. Lieutenant Royden Stork, a professional photographer before military service, frequented the base photo laboratory to obtain film for documenting the training phase and for cameras being installed in the aircraft. Another volunteer with additional duties beyond crew training was Dr. First Lieutenant Thomas R. White, a physician attached to the 89th Reconnaissance Squadron as aviation medical examiner. Upon hearing the call for volunteers for a special mission while traveling to Columbia, Dr. White immediately wired Major Hilger, his squadron commanding officer, to include me somewhere. Hilger was pleased that the squadron doctor, popular among the pilots, wanted to participate. "However, you must train as a crew member, Doctor," he informed him. "That's exactly how I want it, Major," White responded. "I've always wanted to be a gunner," and that's what he became. In subsequent practice at Eglin with the enlisted gunners, he achieved the second highest score with the twin 50 calibers, but no one needed to inform Dr. White of his additional responsibilities. Between sessions on the gunnery range, he reviewed the immunization records of all prospective crew members and immediately inoculated them all for pneumonia, typhus, tetanus, bubonic plague, yellow fever, and smallpox. "I received considerable complaints from the personnel," White recalled, "because for some it meant as many as 11 injections over a 3-week period." One day during the second week at Eglin, Doolittle flew back to Washington to report to Arnold on their progress. After outlining his problems and solutions, he added, "Hap, it occurred to me that I am the only person on this entire project who knows more about it than anyone else. You asked me to get the planes modified and the crews trained, and this is being accomplished. They are the finest group of men I have ever worked with. I would like your permission to lead this mission personally." Arnold stared at Doolittle momentarily. His grin faded. Then he said, "I am sorry, Jimmy. I need you right here on my staff. I cannot afford to let you fly every combat mission you might help plan." Today, Jimmy Doolittle recalls the entire incident with amusement. I launched into my sales presentation, he recalls. And finally Hap shrugged his shoulders and said, "Okay, Jimmy, it is acceptable with me provided it is acceptable with Miff Harmon." When he said that, I stopped talking and departed before he changed his mind. Miff Harmon, General Millard Harmon, who was later lost in the war, was Hap's chief of staff and had his office down the hall. I suspected something, so I ran down the corridor and burst into Miff's office. "Miff," I said, "I have just seen Hap and gave him my report on this project I have been working on. I told him I wanted to lead the mission, and he said it was acceptable with him if it is acceptable with you." Miff was caught off guard, which is what I intended. "Sure, Jimmy," he answered. "Whatever is acceptable with Hap is acceptable with me. Go ahead." I thanked him, and just as I closed the office door, I heard Miff's intercom buzz. It was Hap, and I heard Miff say plaintively, "But Hap, I just gave him my permission since he said it was acceptable with you." I did not wait to hear more. I hurried back to Eglin and hoped Hap would not later order me to stay home. He never did. On his return to Eglin, Doolittle pursued his own personal training program earnestly. "Naturally, I wanted to fly the mission as first pilot," he said, "but I wanted to go only on the basis that I could perform as well as or better than the other pilots who had already started in their training program. So I took Hank Miller's course and was graded along with the others. I succeeded, but if I had not, I would have gone along as a co-pilot and let one of the younger, more proficient pilots occupy the left seat. All the crews flew as teams, which was very important to Doolittle's thinking. He knew that if a group of 5 men fly together day after day and get to know each other's mannerisms and techniques, it is not long before that crew has high morale and is willing to tackle anything. So it was with these men, and, if personality differences appeared or individual proficiency was lacking, adjustments were made. For his crew, Doolittle chose Lieutenant Richard E. Cole as co-pilot, Lieutenant Henry A. Potter, navigator, Sergeant Fred A. Bramer as bombardier, and Sergeant Paul J. Leonard as engineer-gunner. The original pilot, Captain Vernon L. Stintsey, had become ill, and Doolittle flew with them. He had never known any of them before, but he liked the way they worked together. From his first flight with them, he was satisfied they knew their duties. Doolittle depended on his officers to manage the project at Eglin while he flew back and forth to Washington. He kept no records, and did all of his arranging on a person-to-person basis without a single one of his contacts ever knowing what he was planning. By the middle of March, he knew time was getting short. The Hornet had passed through the Panama Canal and was en route to San Francisco by way of San Diego. Duncan had made all the necessary arrangements with Admiral Nimitz's headquarters in Honolulu and had passed the word to General Arnold that he would soon tell him when arrangements were complete. Doolittle kept in personal contact with Arnold on each of his many trips to Washington. Whenever Doolittle had trouble persuading someone to provide equipment or services for the project, that someone received the word directly from Arnold's office shortly thereafter. The word was quickly passed around that whatever Doolittle requested, Doolittle was to receive, no questions asked. Slowly but surely, the men and their equipment were nearing the day of departure for the West Coast. At the end of the 3rd week in March, Wu Duncan wired from Honolulu, "Tell Jimmy to get on his horse." Arnold picked up the phone and passed the same message to Doolittle at Eglin. "Thanks, Hap. See you around," was all his friend said. That simple message was launching 80 brave men and 10,000 naval personnel into an adventure they would never forget. In the weeks between the middle of January and the day Jimmy Doolittle got the signal to head west with his B-25s, the war news had gone from bad to worse to the blackest in the country's entire history. The situation in the Philippines was hopeless. Manila had been declared an open city on the day after Christmas. During the first week of January, American and Filipino troops fought delaying actions as they backed their way down the Bataan Peninsula. Lacking everything but courage, the heroic defenders were reduced to eating dogs, iguanas, monkeys, mules, and snakes to stay alive. On February 22nd, General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to leave Luzon and go to Australia to assume command of Allied forces when, and if, those forces were provided. He finally left on March 22nd, and upon arrival in Darwin announced, "The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines and proceed from Corregidor to Australia for the purpose, as I understand it, of organizing the American offensive against Japan. a primary purpose of which is the relief of the Philippines. I came through and I shall return. While the battle's end was nearing in the Philippines, Hong Kong and Singapore, the other centers of Allied power in the Far East, fell under the onslaught of Japanese air, ground, and sea might. Next on the timetable was Burma, and the teeming city of Rangoon fell on March 7th. Soon after the fall of Singapore, Sumatra was overwhelmed. Java was cut off from the west, and on March 9th, the Netherlands East Indies surrendered with its 98,000 troops. With these successes behind them, the Japanese turned their attention to the next strategy in their master plan, the subjugation of Australia. Port Darwin, the only major naval base in northern Australia, was attacked by the Japanese in February. The next 2 months were spent cutting off the island continent from the north by occupying New Britain, New Ireland, and part of New Guinea, the Admiralty Islands and the Gilberts. Within less than 4 months of that infamous Sunday, the war strategists in Tokyo had masterminded unbelievable conquests. A seemingly backward island nation had quickly expanded itself into a gigantic empire and acquired control over 3 million square miles of land rich in natural resources. The entire Pacific Ocean west of a line drawn from Alaska to Hawaii to Australia was dominated by Japanese military and naval forces. The fall of the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies had encouraged a push westward as well as southward. When the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal fell, there became a very real possibility that Japan would seek to link arms with its Axis partner, Germany. If German forces were to push eastward through the Middle East, a link-up was possible in India. The combined forces would then consolidate their gains and gradually undertake to conquer and subjugate the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere. Their goal of world conquest would then be half won. On February 16, 1942, Brigadier General Martin F. Scanlon, Assistant Chief of the Air Staff for Intelligence, wrote a memorandum to General Arnold, citing the possibility of this pincer movement on India. He predicted that the two Axis powers will attempt a pincer operation on a world scale, with the employment of aircraft within present ranges of design, while forcing the United Nations on a continuous defensive over lines of supply and communications more tenuous and difficult than those of the Axis powers. Scanlon concluded that the only effective and immediate attempt to frustrate the aerial offensive of the Axis nations must be made at Japan's long line of communications. He listed several ways in which his conclusion could be translated into military actions. 1. By the immediate restoration of General MacArthur's position as one capable of severely restraining the freedom of Japanese movements through the China Sea. This should be a major operation which then would assure adequate aerial reinforcement and sufficient increase in the supplies and surface combat forces to assure the success of our operations. 2. By the immediate dispatch into China of available heavy bombardment units, these to commence at once a series of raids upon Japanese communications in China and in the China Seas, and Japan itself. 3. By the seizure, upon diplomatic pretexts, of Russian bases such as Kamchatka for direct air assault upon the Japanese homeland. 4. In conjunction with the above, air raids from carriers against Japan. 5. By continuing pressure upon the Malay barrier from the continent of Australia with the use of long-range air bombardment of Japan's central position at Singapore, with diversions aimed at tactical surprise by carrier-based aircraft, such as our naval forces recently achieved in the Marshall Islands. Although General Scanlon was a highly trusted member of Hap Arnold's staff, he was not aware of Jimmy Doolittle's plans. He knew that his recommendations were sound, but, being a military realist, he thought that it would be many months before they could be carried out. It was early morning when Admiral William F. Bull Halsey's Task Force 13 put to sea from Pearl Harbor. On board his flagship, the Enterprise, Halsey squared his long-billed baseball cap and watched the destroyers Balch and Maury as they zigzagged and screened ahead. The cruisers, Northampton and Salt Lake City, plodded off to port and starboard. Task Force 13 was headed for Wake Island. On February 24th, Task Force 13 was standing 75 miles off Wake, waiting to launch her planes. At 7:10 a.m., the cruisers, closer in, opened up with their 8-inch guns. A dozen fires immediately erupted among the buildings on the tiny island. Then the planes from the Enterprise roared in and raked the atoll with bullets and explosives. 3 flying boats were destroyed and 1 small boat sunk. As a surprise, the raid was a success. From the standpoint of damage done, the risk was hardly worth the effort. Halsey decided to make a bolder raid. After zigzagging on erratic courses for several days to throw off any possible pursuit, he set course for Marcus Island, a tiny speck in the Pacific, less than 1,000 miles southeast of Tokyo. On March 4th, while the moon was full, 40 of Halsey's planes zoomed in on the few buildings and airstrip and laced them with 50 calibers. The buildings and a gasoline dump were left burning. No enemy planes were sighted, but anti-aircraft fire was heavy, and one American scout bomber was shot down. These two raids were planned only as diversionary moves to attempt to convince the Japanese they should pull their forces up from the south and release the pressure on the Philippines. The Japanese, however, were not to be deterred. It would take more than hit-and-run raids on two mid-ocean atolls to slow down their steamrolling toward Australia. Duncan was extremely tired by the time he landed in Honolulu. He had flown from Washington to Hawaii for only one purpose, and that was to inform the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, of the plan to bomb Tokyo with army bombers. He made his way directly to the office of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. His orders gave no clue to his mission, merely stating that he was to be on temporary duty for a period in excess of 72 hours. Admiral King had informed Nimitz that Duncan was coming to see him and that the plan he was to discuss had his backing and support. Nimitz had no idea what it was, but knew it had to be important to send an officer all the way to Hawaii to discuss it. Nimitz was truly a man of cheerful yesterdays and confident tomorrows, as his Academy class yearbook had noted. The calmest of men, he was a genius for making prompt, right decisions and had a tremendous capacity for work. He created an atmosphere of quiet efficiency wherever he was and had immediately restored confidence to the defeated Pacific Fleet upon his assignment after the Pearl Harbor disaster. Duncan's plan was to his liking. It would be just the job for Bill Halsey, now waiting for his next orders. Nimitz called in Halsey to meet Duncan and explain the plan. Halsey recalled their meeting later. Miles Browning and I were called to Commander-in-Chief Pacific's headquarters for a conference with Rear Admiral Donald B. Duncan, from Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet. Ernie King, not liking the implication of Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, may have changed his title to Commander-in-Chief by then. I am not certain. Duncan told us that something big was in the air, something top secret. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, with Navy cooperation, had trained 16 Army crews to take B-25s off a carrier's deck, and the Navy had promised to launch them for Tokyo. They might not inflict much damage, Wu said, but they would certainly give Hirohito plenty to think about. Chester Nimitz asked me, "Do you believe it would work, Bill?" I said, "They will need a lot of luck." "Are you willing to take them out there?" "Yes, I am." "Good," he said. "It is all yours." I suggested that the operation would run more smoothly if Miles and I could discuss it person to person with Doolittle, whom I had never met. Chester agreed and gave us orders to proceed to San Francisco. Duncan stayed in Hawaii long enough to make sure that Halsey and the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Planning Staff had all the facts they needed. He then wired Washington the message to have Doolittle proceed to the West Coast. Duncan left Pearl Harbor for San Diego to meet Mitcher, who had just come through the Panama Canal in the Hornet. This was Mitcher's first knowledge of the forthcoming mission, and he was delighted that he was to have a part in it. It was not until then that he realized why Duncan had come aboard in Norfolk the previous month and had him launch the two B-25s. From San Diego, Duncan went to San Francisco to await the arrival of Doolittle from Eglin and Halsey from Hawaii. When the crews had all reported to the flying line at Eglin in the morning of March 23rd, Doolittle gave them a short talk. "Today is the day we move out," he told them. "Those who are going know who you are. Those not going with us will clean things up here and report back to Columbia. Remember what I have told you time and time again. Do not tell anyone what we were doing down here, even if you think you have guessed what our mission is. Just keep in mind that they are your buddies who are going, and their lives depend on you not breathing a word of this to another soul." He dismissed all but the crews of the 22 planes chosen for the trip. 2 planes had been damaged during the training at Eglin. These men were then told to fly their planes to McClellan Field, near Sacramento, California. Doolittle arrived at McClellan on March 26th and met with the commanding officer of the Sacramento Air Depot, Colonel John M. Clark. and his top engineering personnel to discuss the inspection job on the B-25s. He insisted that nothing be tampered with or removed. The airplanes were simply to be inspected. He explained that a number of installations would be made, among them new propellers, the 60-gallon rubber gas tanks in the rear compartments where the lower turrets had been removed, new covers for the leak-proof bomb bay tanks. The original covers had been made too small, causing wrinkles and, consequently, leaks, hydraulic valves for the gun turrets, back-type parachutes to replace the seat type, and other important details. The liaison radio was to be removed, and new glass navigational windows were to replace the present plexiglass ones. Doolittle was informed that not all of this material had been received at the depot as yet. Doolittle did his best to instill a sense of urgency in the civilian maintenance men at the depot, but he did not have much luck. As one of Doolittle's pilots said later, "There is always someone who does not get the word." The sense of urgency had not filtered down with the instructions. The civilian maintenance crews went ahead in a leisurely way, checking the planes and equipment. Doolittle advised his crews to stay with their planes and watch the work being done. They were to report anything they did not like to him or Ski York. It was not long before the complaints started. Ted Lawson described his experience in his book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. "I had to stand by and watch one of the mechanics rev my engines so fast that the new blades picked up dirt which pockmarked their tips. I caught another one trying to sandpaper the imperfections away and yelled at him until he got some oil and rubbed it on the places which he had sandpapered. I knew that salt air would make those prop tips pulpy when they had been scraped. The way they revved our motors made us wince. All of us were so afraid that they would hurt the ships, the way they were handling them, yet we could not tell them why we wanted them to be so careful. I guess we must have acted like the biggest bunch of complainers those mechanics ever saw, but we kept objecting until Doolittle got on the long-distance phone, called Washington, and had the work done the way we wanted it done." Doolittle had indeed called Washington. He refused to speak to anyone except Hap Arnold. "Things are going too slowly out here," he told his chief. "I would appreciate it if you would light a fire under somebody. They are treating this whole project as routine, and that would not get the job done in time." Arnold reacted immediately. What had been treated as a routine inspection of combat-bound airplanes suddenly became the most important project on the base, and the men and machines of the B-25B project became a focal point of B-25B project. Interest. These were strange aircraft when one thought about it. Broomsticks instead of guns in the tails. No liaison radios. Shiny new propellers which were promptly painted as soon as they were installed. A strange-looking device in place of the bomb sight. Rubber gas tanks and no lower gun turrets, and the crews seemed like an odd bunch, too. If they were asked what it was all about, their answer was, inevitably, mind your own business. A clannish group, they avoided the regular personnel on the base and, without regard for rank, stuck together off-duty as well as on. Jack Hilger, Ski York, Ross Greening and the other pilots practically lived on the McClellan flying line, fretting about the condition of their planes during the week after their arrival. None of them was satisfied with the speed or the quality of the work being done. The grumbling of the crews reached Doolittle, and he conveyed the complaints to the civilian supervisors. Improvement was still not forthcoming. The series of annoyances reached a climax one afternoon when Doolittle was talking with Jack Hilger and several other pilots in McClellan base operations. Outside, a civilian mechanic was attempting to start one of the B-25s. An engine churned briefly, then backfired violently. Doolittle stopped talking, saw black smoke pouring out of the recalcitrant engine and literally exploded out of the building on a dead run. As he ran, he shouted at the man to shut down the engine, but was rewarded only by more backfiring. Doolittle ripped open the forward hatch, leaped up into the cockpit and almost yanked the man from the pilot's seat. The reason Doolittle was angry was obvious to his pilots. The carburetors on all the planes had been carefully bench-checked at Eglin and were in perfect condition. They were so finely tuned that the engines had to be started with a precise procedure. Careless starting, which would cause backfiring, could throw them out of adjustment and increase fuel consumption dangerously. Doolittle knew better than anyone else that lives would depend on the most efficient engine operation possible. When Doolittle calmed down, the mechanic explained that he was merely running the engines up as he was required to do after the carburetors had been adjusted. "What?" Do you mean that somebody fooled around with these carburetors without my okay? All I know is that they were checked, found way out of adjustment and fixed up, was the reply. To Doolittle, this remark was the last straw. He ordered his men to check over everything being done to their planes and let him know what was wrong. He conveyed their collective complaints to the engineering officer and the base commander. In addition, he again called General Arnold and told him what had happened. Arnold called the Air Service Command at Wright Field and demanded a report. Colonel Clark's teletyped reply, received the day after the B-25s had left McClellan, defended the depot men and pointed out that frequently pilots tended to worry too much about the condition of their airplanes as their departure date for overseas approached. Clark admitted, however, that the depot was having a hard time finding and keeping experienced personnel. During their stay at McClellan, Doolittle and Hilger had roomed together in the bachelor officers' quarters. On the morning of March 30th, Doolittle mentioned that he had to go into San Francisco to meet his wife, Jo, who was coming in from Los Angeles where she had been visiting her ill father. What Hilger did not know was that, coincidentally, Doolittle had received a message from Washington saying that he was to meet Admiral Halsey that night in a downtown restaurant. That evening, over dinner in an out-of-the-way dining room, Halsey, Captain Miles Browning, his chief of staff, Duncan and Doolittle discussed details of the forthcoming raid candidly. The Hornet, in company with the cruisers Nashville and Vincennes, the oiler Cimarron and the destroyers Gwyn, Meredith, Monson and Grayson of Destroyer Division 22, were to be designated as Task Group 16.2 and leave San Francisco on April 2nd with Captain Mark Mitcher as Task Force Commander. Halsey, on the carrier Enterprise, would leave Hawaii on April 7th, accompanied by the cruisers Northampton and Salt Lake City, the oiler Sabine and Destroyer Division 6, consisting of the Balch, Benham, Ellet and Fanning. This group of ships would be Task Group 16.1. Rendezvous of these two forces, to be known as Task Force 16 after they merged, was to take place on Sunday, April 12th, at latitude 38 degrees north, longitude 180 degrees. This combined armada would steam westward and refuel from the Cimarron and Sabine 800 miles off the coast of Japan. The oilers would then detach themselves and the rest of the force would dash toward the enemy homeland for the launch. Halsey later reported that our talk boiled down to this: we would carry Jimmy within 400 miles of Tokyo if we could sneak in that close. But if we were discovered sooner, we would have to launch him anyway, provided he was in reach of either Tokyo or Midway. That suited Jimmy. We shook hands and I wished him luck. The next time I saw him, he was Lieutenant General Doolittle, wearing the Medal of Honor. What Halsey did not mention, but what Doolittle fully appreciated when he left that meeting, was that the Navy was taking a magnificent risk in the operation. If any word leaked out to the Japanese, the United States Navy could suffer a loss almost as great as at Pearl Harbor. 16 surface ships, the largest American naval force that could be mustered in the Pacific, would be heading westward together. They would be ideal targets for a small, marauding Japanese submarine force. Coupled with Japanese land-based aviation attacks, the Halsey force could be intercepted many miles before the planned launching point. If a heavy enemy task force were alerted and given the mission to sail eastward to engage Task Force 16, it could mean the end of American naval strength in the Pacific. Doolittle also knew what would happen if Halsey's ships were attacked and they were not within reach of Japan with his B-25s. The Mitchells would be summarily kicked over the side so the Hornet's planes could be brought up on deck and launched to protect the fleet. All he could hope was that his continual pleas for secrecy had prevented any information about the raid from getting to the enemy. After he left Halsey, Doolittle telephoned Jack Hilger at McClellan, double-talking in such a way that Hilger would be the only man in the world who could understand if the conversation were being overheard. He told him to spread the word that the B-25s were to be loaded aboard the Hornet the next day. That night, Hilger put out the order to his pilots to round up their crews and report to the flight line at daybreak. All crews were to check their planes over carefully and fly them to nearby Alameda Naval Air Station. "This is it," he told them. "When we get over there, we will want to know if there is anything wrong with your ships. Give them a good test flight and put at least an hour's time on them." Giving the order to his crews did not mean that he was not going to have trouble getting his planes out of the hands of the McClellan maintenance crews. Since all the work had not been completed, regulations would not allow the planes to be released to their crews. But Hilger had his orders, and after heated arguments with base engineering personnel, finally got his planes on their way one by one. Doolittle arrived and made out his flight plan for the short hop to Alameda. He was handed a report form to fill out which asked for his opinion of the work performed on the planes while at that station. He took one look at it and wrote diagonally across the form a single word, poor. The base operations officer looked startled when he saw the remark. "Just a minute, Colonel. You will have to give me a detailed report. This simply will not do." "I have not got time," Doolittle snorted as he turned and headed for his B-25. "I will not sign your clearance then, Colonel," the young officer called after the disappearing Doolittle. He stared in disbelief as the man climbed into his airplane, started the engines, and took off. The infuriated operations officer turned to Jack Hilger and shouted, "Who does that guy think he is? I can tell you he is heading for a lot of trouble." Hilger had watched the whole incident with a smile on his face. "He sure is," he drawled. "He sure is." As the planes landed at Alameda, Doolittle and Ski York were on hand to greet each pilot. "Anything wrong with your ship?" they asked. If the pilot admitted some engine or other plane malfunction, he was directed to a nearby hangar instead of the wharf. When 16 planes had been parked at the wharf, Doolittle told York, "These planes will go. If you have any last-minute malfunctions, substitute one of the other planes. Tell all the crews to get aboard the Hornet whether or not their plane is on the dock." Those who had to leave their B-25s at the hangar were the crews who would not fly the mission unless somebody dropped out. Navy handlers swarmed over the B-25s as soon as their crews shut down the engines. Gas was drained out of the tanks. A Navy device hooked a tow bar to the nose gear of each plane and towed it down to the pier. The crews walked solemnly behind their respective planes and watched silently as the huge dockside crane reached down and picked them up as if they weighed only a few pounds. Once their planes were aboard, the crews filed up the gangplank of the Hornet where Hank Miller waited for them on deck. "I was proud of those fellows that day," Miller recalled. As each man came aboard, he saluted the national ensign and then the officer of the deck and said, "Sergeant or Lieutenant or Captain so-and-so, reporting aboard for duty, sir." They were a smart-looking outfit, and I was mighty proud of the way they responded to my teaching. They looked smarter in all respects than the Navy personnel that were going to and fro. The crew of the Hornet was mystified by the requirement to hoist the B-25s aboard, but went about their tasks as if they handled Air Force bombers on their decks every day. The night before, Miller had gone aboard the Hornet to make final arrangements for hoisting the planes. "Of course," he recalled. "I met many officers whom I had known before, and all of them were obsessed with curiosity as to where they were going. Everyone tried to find out from me, but I kept mum. Several officers who knew that I was from Alaska speculated that the mission would be somewhere around the Aleutian Islands. They were completely in the dark until the announcement was made later." On one of the flights Doolittle made to Washington before leaving Eglin, he talked at length with Hap Arnold about arrangements to receive his planes in China. It had been decided a month before that secrecy could not be maintained in dealing with Chiang Kai-shek's staff. On February 9th, Brigadier General John Magruder had sent a wire to General Marshall concerning conferences with the Chinese and noted, "Despite my request for confidential treatment of matter, at height of interview, an unexpectedly drawn curtain disclosed 4 servants absorbing the facts. This is characteristic and indicates futility of efforts to maintain secrecy regarding any military matters." Marshall immediately sent a memorandum to Arnold saying, "With relation to the highly confidential project you and King have on, please read Magruder's telegram of yesterday regarding lack of secrecy in all discussions at Chungking." With this information, Arnold decided not to tell anyone in Chungking about the Doolittle mission, although General Joseph E. Vinegar Joe Stilwell had been told the bare essentials of the project before he left the States in February to take over the Tang, China, Burma, and India Command. The need for preparation of 5 airfields to receive the first special aviation project was discussed, but Stilwell was not told from where the planes were to come. No word was forthcoming from Stilwell's headquarters concerning airfield preparation after his arrival. On March 16th, Arnold requested information on the progress of airports and bomb and gas supplies at the agreed-upon airports in eastern China. 2 days later, Arnold sent Stilwell another urgent message. "Reference special air project discussed with you before departure. Time for spotting gas at agreed points getting short." 4 days later, Stillwell wired Arnold that the Standard Oil Company of Calcutta had 500 gallons of grade 120 oil in 5-gallon tins and 30,000 gallons of 100-octane gasoline. He wanted to know why it was needed and requested authority to move it to China. Stillwell's lack of appreciation for the growing urgency expressed by Arnold's wires was understandable. He was not an airman and did not sympathize with the problems of flyers. Because of the extreme need for secrecy to protect Halsey's task force as well as Doolittle's crews, the communications between Washington and Chungking were limited to the essentials of advising both Stillwell and the Generalissimo what needed to be done, without informing them of the details or the strategic purpose of the project. Still, it was necessary to have Chiang's approval of the undertaking before the bombers could land in China. The Generalissimo did not want the B-25s to land there after bombing Tokyo because he feared a violent Japanese reaction. His wishes were, in effect, overruled. By March 25th, Arnold was getting more concerned that arrangements were not shaping up in China. He sent a message to Stillwell specifying the amounts of high-octane gasoline and aviation oil that would be needed, the airports in China where they were to be located, and the arrangements to be made at the airports for landing the B-25s. On the 29th, Stillwell radioed Arnold that he recommended the use of Chinese gasoline instead of attempting to fly in American gasoline from India, due to lack of communications, time shortage, and impossibility of secrecy. He advised Arnold that Kuilin and Chuchao were the only fields safe for heavy bomber operations according to the Chinese. Chiang Kai-shek had disapproved the use of Yushan, Qian, or Lishui by heavy bombers unless an inspection was made by an American officer. As soon as Stillwell's message was received in Washington, Arnold dictated a memorandum for Admiral King and asked that he forward the information on to Doolittle. Arnold mentioned the quantities of gasoline and oil available at the 5 Chinese fields and added that these figures were furnished on personal directive of Generalissimo by Chief, Chinese Air Force, and are believed reliable. Arnold then dictated a message to Stillwell. Special project will arrive destination on April 20th. Should a change in arrival date arise, an attempt will be made to notify you. You must, however, be prepared for variation without notice. After his conference with Halsey, Doolittle boarded the Hornet and conferred with Mitcher. 15 B-25s had been hoisted aboard and tied down. "I think she will take one more," Doolittle told the little skipper with the leathery face and bright blue eyes. Since none of the lads have actually made a carrier takeoff, it would give them a lot of confidence to see a B-25 take off. About 100 miles out, we could send that 16th plane back. We could take Hank Miller along and let him co-pilot. Mitcher rubbed his jaw thoughtfully a moment and then answered, "Okay, Jimmy, it is your show." He ordered the 16th B-25 hoisted aboard and told Miller to find himself a bunk. At 3 p.m. on April 1st, the Hornet unmoored, moved to berth number 9 in the middle of San Francisco Bay at dusk, and anchored. The crews of the B-25s had been assigned quarters throughout the ship and had settled down as best they could. Much to their surprise, Doolittle called them together and after a brief lecture about secrecy let them go ashore for the evening. The sudden freedom gave the crews a last chance for a fling in San Francisco, and most of them took advantage of it. Several of the pilots made their way to the top of the Mark Hopkins Hotel to view the sights. Lieutenant Dick Knobloch, co-pilot on the crew of Lieutenant Edgar E. McElroy, began to wonder. There below them, in plain sight of whoever cared to look, was the Hornet with their planes lashed crisscross on her deck. He nudged Ross Greening and whispered, "I hope they rounded up all the Japanese spies. If they did not, I hope they think those things are just being transported to Hawaii." Greening nodded and grinned. "What is the matter, Nobi? Don't you know that you cannot take a B-25 off a carrier?" he asked mockingly. Knobloch grinned in reply. He hoped Greening was only kidding. After giving his men their last night on the town, Jimmy Doolittle went to the hotel where his wife, Jo, was staying while in San Francisco for a few days. On the morning of April 2nd, he packed his B-4 aviator's bag, kissed her tenderly and said casually, "I will be seeing you. I may be out of the country for a little while. Call you when I get back." Jo Doolittle, after many years of hellos and goodbyes, had grown used to it almost. Jimmy always used the same casualness with her, and she never knew until after the fact that he had risked his neck in some way and had set a new record, won a race, or achieved another aviation first. This time, as all other times before and since, she held back the questions and began a wait that was to last almost 2 months. Returning to the Hornet, Doolittle went to Mitch's cabin. The two discussed the departure plans and agreed that all hands should be told their destination after the force was a day out of port. At that time, the 16th plane would be sent back to the mainland. As they concluded their conversation, there was a knock on the door. It was the intelligence officer with messages from Washington. It was then that Doolittle learned that the arrangements for gas, oil, and airport marking he had requested in China were being made. Along with this message, relayed from Stilwell, were 2 other messages, both dated March 31st, 1942. May good luck and success be with you and each member of your command on the mission you are about to undertake. Arnold. As you embark on your expedition, please give each member of your command my deep appreciation of their services and complete confidence in their ability and courage under your leadership to strike a mighty blow. You will be constantly in my mind, and may the good Lord watch over you. Marshall. There was also a personal message to Mitcher from Admiral King. It read, I hope and expect that the first war operation of the Hornet will be a success. I am confident that it will be insofar as her officers and crew under your able leadership can make it so. Good luck and good hunting. What the log of the Hornet does not record is that the San Francisco harbor was basking in bright sunlight, although visibility was poor. To men like Hilger, York, Greening, and others, it seemed like sheer madness to be sailing on their mission in broad daylight. As they passed under the Golden Gate and Oakland bridges, they could see the hundreds of automobiles crossing overhead. Thousands of people were watching them go with their B-25s lashed firmly on the Hornet's decks. The Navy has never explained why such a risk was taken. However, the crews on these ships were not all old hands. Captain Frederick L. Reefcole, skipper of the Vincennes, commented in an interview that, I was rather skeptical about our crew at the time, as many of my old-time men who had been on her almost a year had left, and we sailed from there with a crew that was practically 50% recruits. It is perhaps for this reason that it was decided not to attempt a night departure. While his men worried about their chances of survival, their leader had a different kind of worry. Ever since he had wangled permission from Arnold to lead the mission, he was afraid that he would be pulled off at the last moment. Just before the Hornet started down the channel, he was ordered ashore in the captain's gig to answer an urgent telephone call from Washington. Doolittle recalled, I thought it was going to be Hap Arnold telling me I could not go. My heart sank because I wanted to go on that mission more than anything since I had planned it and worked on it from the beginning. When I got ashore, it turned out that it was General Marshall calling. I might have tried to argue with Hap, but not General Marshall. Now I knew that the jig was up. Doolittle? Marshall said. Yes, General, I answered. I just called to wish you the best of luck, he said. Our thoughts and our prayers will be with you. Goodbye. Good luck, and come home safely. All I could think of to say was, thank you, sir. Thank you. I went back to the Hornet feeling much better. At 11:48, the Hornet and her protectors passed Channel Buoy No. 1 abeam to starboard and entered swept channel. Captain Mitcher was relieved by the officer of the deck, and the crew settled down into their practiced routine. Mitcher's orders were to take a meandering, circuitous route to the point of rendezvous with Halsey's force on the 12th. Unknown to anyone on the Hornet, Halsey was having a little difficulty getting back to Hawaii. Miles and I had expected to be back in Pearl on the 2nd, he wrote later, in ample time to polish our plans for the mission, but stray westerly winds grounded all westbound planes. We telephoned the air operations officer at Alameda and Pan American every day, and every day we were given the same report. On the 5th, we had to notify the Hornet to postpone our rendezvous for 24 hours. On the 6th, already sore and sour, I added a touch of flu to my other worries and took to my bed, loaded with medicine pills. Naturally, this was the afternoon that the winds died and our flight was scheduled. When I boarded the plane, I was so full of pills that I rattled, but I slept until a nosebleed woke me as we lost altitude for our landing, and I stepped off at Honolulu with the flu licked. At dusk on April 2nd, the first of many Hornet battle drills was called. All Navy personnel raced to battle stations. The B-25 crews rushed to their planes and simulated getting them airborne. The gunners on each crew practiced unlimbering their turret guns. From that time on, every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk, Mitchell ordered all personnel to battle stations. If an emergency arose, the B-25 crews would know the most expeditious method of getting to their planes and either flying them off or pushing them over the side. Just before noon the next day, Hank Miller was on the flight deck talking to Lieutenant Dick Joyce. According to the plan, the two of them were to take the 16th plane back to the mainland that afternoon. While they were chatting, Jimmy Doolittle approached. "Talk to you a minute, Hank?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Miller answered. The two walked over to Joyce's plane. Doolittle looked quizzically down the deck toward the bow a moment, then climbed up into the cockpit and settled into the pilot's seat. Miller followed and dropped into the co-pilot's seat. "That distance looks mighty short to me, Hank," Doolittle said, motioning toward the gently plunging bow. "You know, Colonel Doolittle," Miller answered confidently, "this is a breeze. You see that toolkit that is away up the deck there? That is where I used to take off in fighters." Doolittle was quiet a moment, then smiled at Miller and said, "Hank, what do they call baloney in the Navy?" The two pilots, both with a healthy respect for the other, chatted briefly and then parted. Doolittle made his way to the bridge. Miller went below to the pilot's wardroom for lunch. Just as Miller was finishing dessert, the ship's loudspeaker blared, "Lieutenant Miller, report to the captain on the bridge." When Miller got to the bridge, Doolittle was just leaving. Obviously, Doolittle and Mitchell had been talking about his flight. When Doolittle was gone, Mitchell asked him how he felt about making the takeoff. "We probably cannot give you 40 knots of wind over the deck today, Miller. Still want to try it?" Miller assured him that he did. "We will not need 40 knots, Captain, because we will have 460 feet to take off. We can make it easily with what you can crank up in the Hornet, sir." Mitchell looked at Miller thoughtfully a moment and then asked, "Do you have any of your clothes aboard?" "Yes, sir. I brought my clothes aboard because we are going to deliver this plane back to Columbus, South Carolina." "Why do you ask, sir?" "Well, if there is no strain in getting off, we will take that extra plane." Miller was surprised. "Well, that is fine, sir. But would you drop me off at the next mail buoy, please? I have been traveling halfway around the world on the strength of a phone call. When I get back to Pensacola, I will probably be an ensign again." Mitchell just grinned. If the B-25s got off successfully and the Hornet survived this dangerous intrusion into Japanese waters, he was sure the Navy would see to it that the career of one lieutenant, senior grade, would suffer no ill effects. A short time after Miller's discussion with Mitchell, a Navy blimp arrived over the Hornet. 2 boxes containing the navigator's windows Doolittle had ordered were lowered to the flight deck. Air coverage was being provided by PBY patrol planes from the Western Sea frontier. Below decks, the B-25 crews were settling themselves into their assigned quarters. The relationship between the Air Force and Navy personnel was, as Ross Greening described, slightly strained and defensive. Doolittle's men, remembering their leader's continual warnings about secrecy, refused to give any information to the curious Navy men. There were no evidences of open dislikes, Greening reported, only a defensive aloofness. He added that it was only natural the Navy men would think the Army was overdoing its part and the Army was in no mood to jeopardize its security until it was completely safe for the Navy to know the nature of the mission. On the afternoon of April 2nd, Mitchell decided to tell Task Group 16.2 where they were going. He told his chief signal officer to notify the rest of the ships by semaphore that this force is bound for Tokyo. On his own ship, the Hornet, he made the same announcement over the loudspeaker. The reaction to Mitchell's words was immediate. Cheers from every section of the ship greeted the announcement, he said, and morale reached a new high, there to remain until after the attack was launched and the ship was well clear of combat areas. Now all rumors were dispelled. Doolittle had encouraged his men, if pressed, to further the idea that the B-25s were only being transported to Hawaii. No one on the West Coast knew of their takeoff training at Eglin, and anyone familiar with airplanes knew that combat-loaded medium land-based bombers could never lift themselves from a carrier deck. But it was official now that Jimmy Doolittle and his men were going to try. The effect on the part of both Navy and Air Force men was immediate. Relationships improved in a matter of seconds, Greening recalled, and immediately all hands, Army, Air Force, and Navy, joined together to accomplish all that was necessary to satisfactorily complete the mission. The Air Force crews had already been told where they were going. Doolittle had called them together in the empty mess hall after breakfast that morning and said, "For the benefit of those of you who have not already been told or have been guessing, we are going to bomb Japan. Our targets will be in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The Navy will get us in as close as possible and launch us off the deck. After hitting our targets, we will head for small fields in China, gas up, and then fly on to Chongqing. Everything is set, and you will be getting all the information you will need during the days ahead." Doolittle concluded this brief meeting by giving all of the crew members a chance to withdraw and be replaced by one of the spare crews. No one did. The entire Air Force contingent aboard the Hornet was relieved to find out at last where their mission was taking them. The long period of enforced silence had inhibited the group so badly that many of them later admitted they could not really get serious about the mission until they knew where they were going. Now that they knew, the whole scheme suddenly fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle. The takeoff practice, the overwater navigation flights, the concern about the carburetors, the new props, everything now added up. Instinctively, the thoughts of all the flyers went to the condition of their planes. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners, almost as if by order, went to their respective crew positions in each plane. There now was a clear purpose to the whole affair, and they were glad to be a part of it. The greatest burden of concern fell on the pilots. All 16 of them, at one time or another, paced off the distance between the island and the bow of the ship. Singly and in pairs, they would measure the distance, counting as they went and ending up with similar conclusions. That distance was mighty short, and not a one of them had ever taken their 25s off in those few feet at Eglin. Doolittle had assured them it could be done, but he had never done it. Miller had said it would be no strain, but, again, he did not know from actual experience. Doolittle had been told that 2 B-25s had been launched from the Hornet earlier, but he had not seen them do it. There was only one thing they could do: put their trust and faith in the boss. They knew he would be piloting the first plane off and would have the shortest length of deck. If he could do it, so could they. The next day, after all hands knew where they were going and why, Doolittle introduced 2 naval officers, Commander Apollo Soucek and Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jurica. Soucek was air officer for the Hornet and gave them instructions on carrier operations. Jurica was the Hornet's intelligence officer. As soon as he was introduced, it was obvious why he had the job. "My connection with the Doolittle raid actually began in Tokyo, in 1939, he recalled years later. I was assigned as assistant naval attaché and naval attaché for air to the American embassy in Tokyo. We did not have bombing maps of Japan, and one of my principal tasks during the ensuing 2 years was to make these. I spent most of my time locating and pinpointing industries, industrial areas, and all manner of bomb target information. One of my greatest sources of information at this time was the Soviet naval attaché, who had a wealth of information on Japanese industry. He used liberal quantities of vodka in an attempt to elicit information from me, but I was able to pour a great many of his drinks into his potted palms without his knowing it. He attempted to get information from me about our forces in the Far East, but he was a great source of information on Japanese industry. Among other ways we had of obtaining information was sailing in the bay from Tokyo to Yokohama, journeying on American ships from Yokohama to Kobe, and photographing the ports and shipyards we passed en route. At the end of my 2-year tour, we had quite a dossier on Japanese industry. In 1941, Jurica returned to the United States, served briefly in the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, and was then assigned to the Hornet. He knew the target cities the B-25 crews were going to attack better than he knew his hometown. Jurica spoke to the crews almost every day, telling them of the history of Japan, the customs and political ideologies. He discussed the strange, to the American way of thinking, psychological differences between the Occidental and the Oriental, and the physiological differences between the Chinese and Japanese. Most important, however, he showed the crews the best route to enter Japan, pass over the industrial areas and depart, which would keep the planes away from the anti-aircraft batteries and yet give them good aiming points to hit their targets. During the briefings, Jurica said, "I covered the locations of the Japanese industries. anti-aircraft batteries, and such wonderful aiming points as the Diet Building Towers and the 3 radio towers near the Navy Ministry in downtown Tokyo. I showed them where the Imperial Palace was and how to avoid that. In general, I covered all the escape and evasion tactics which could be used to get in and out in one piece. Eureka also recalled that many of Doolittle's men did not seem to pay much attention to his lectures. I felt that most of the pilots, with the exception of Colonel Doolittle, were far more interested in getting their aircraft off the flight deck of the Hornet than they were in any possible troubles they might encounter over Japan. There were very few questions during these briefings. Other lectures were arranged by Doolittle for the benefit of his crews. He asked Dr. White of Lieutenant Don Smith's crew to give them talks on first aid. Doctor cautioned them particularly to take immediate care of any scratch or cut. As you know, they use night soil for fertilizer in China, he told them. Everything is tremendously infected with a very potent organism. The Chinese themselves are immune to it, or else they die in infancy. The tiniest scratch will get a raging infection in it within a few hours. Whatever you do, take every nick and scratch seriously, as if your life depended on it, because it will. Commander Frank Akers, the Hornet's navigator, gave an air navigation refresher course to the B-25 pilots. He, too, was dismayed that his students did not seem to take the instructions seriously. The pilots were a carefree, happy group, and seemed little concerned as to the danger of the mission or what might happen to them if they were shot down over Japan, he said. A great many of them grew beards, and our suggestions that this was giving the Japanese an additional torture device in case they wished to pluck them out had no effect. While the Navy personnel may have thought Doolittle's men were taking their forthcoming mission too light-heartedly, their self-imposed training program would not bear this out. The gunners were given practice sessions with their turret guns at kites let out behind the Hornet. When they were not firing and cleaning their guns, they worried about the general condition of their planes. Since all gunners, with the exception of Dr. White, were airplane mechanics as well, they tinkered and fixed from morning to night, stopping only long enough to eat and sleep. Their ground school consisted of aircraft identification classes as well as the lectures by Dr. White. It was Doolittle's practice to speak to his men as a group 2 or 3 times each day. After he had told them what their target cities were to be, and Eureka had given them their first lecture on the geography of Japan, he allowed each pilot to choose the target city he wanted to bomb and the airfield in China where he wanted to land. Each of the 16 crews, after studying the selection, had a brief discussion among themselves, finally agreed on their choices, and target folders were then passed out. You are to bomb only military targets, Doolittle told them, and I do not want any of you to get any ideas that you are going to bomb the Temple of Heaven, the Imperial Palace. And avoid hospitals, schools, and other non-military targets. Most planes will carry 3 500-pound demolition bombs and 1 500-pound incendiary. You will drop the demolitions in the shortest space of time, preferably in a straight line, where they will do the most damage. You will drop the incendiary cluster as near to the others as possible in an area that looks like it will burn. If you can start a couple of good fires in a Japanese city, their buildings are so inflammable they will never put them out. Avoid all stone, concrete and steel targets because you cannot do much damage to them. One pilot, wondering if Doolittle wanted them to bomb Japanese civilian homes, deliberately asked, "Colonel, should we save the incendiaries for the residential area?" Definitely not. You are to look for and aim at military targets only, such as war industries, shipbuilding facilities, power plants, and the like. Doolittle repeated his admonition many times not to bomb the Emperor's palace. He reminded them that bombing industries was an act of strategic warfare, but that bombing the palace deliberately could be interpreted by friend and foe alike as an inhuman and barbaric act. It is not worth a plane factory, a shipyard, or an oil refinery, so leave it alone, he told them again and again. While the Army Air Force crews sweated and fretted about their planes and their forthcoming mission, they were unaware of the events that were taking place in China. On the day the Hornet had finished loading and moved to its anchorage in the middle of San Francisco Bay, raids were begun by Japanese bombers and fighters on the Chinese fields the Doolittle flyers were to use. Fortunately, negligible damage was done, but these forays presaged the movement of Japanese ground forces southeastward. It would probably not be long before the entire area surrounding the 5 fields would be lost. In addition to the threat of losing the bases, difficulty was being experienced in providing radio homing beacons at the 5 fields. General Arnold wired Chungking on April 2nd, requesting that transmitter frequencies between 200 and 1,600 kilocycles be made available for the first special aviation project. However, no one in China yet knew the full reason for the requests, which now had to be complied with before the night of April 19th. On April 5th, it was reported that with the exception of Yushan, the other 4 fields could provide adequate radio facilities for homing use. On April 6th, General Arnold ordered that the numbers 57 be used for identification. On the surface, it appeared that the details of the raid were all being taken care of. However, misunderstandings were developing between Chungking and Washington because of the necessity for secrecy. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek had reluctantly given his assent to the project on March 28th without knowing any of the details. He was apprehensive about the use of Chinese air bases after a raid on Japan because of the possibility of massive retaliation against his people by the Japanese. The details of the project were also kept from Colonel Claire L. Chenot, commander of the famous Flying Tigers who were flying for Chiang. Even though he was given a short briefing by Stilwell and Colonel Clayton Bissell, Stilwell's air officer, on March 29th, he was not told when or from where the B-25s were to come. It was a precaution that, ironically, might have saved some of the planes because the East China air warning net had been perfected by Chenot and was under his control. Unfortunately, Stilwell did not know just how good that net was, nor the life-saving role Chenot's system could have played if only he had been informed. Bissell made several attempts to carry out Arnold's orders regarding landing and refueling facilities. He commandeered an ancient C-39 cargo transport and sent it out to survey the fields in China. Records do not reveal exactly what happened to the C-39 or its pilot, but the plane crashed and the mission was never completed. 10 days later, on April 12th, Bissell tried again, this time sending 2 United States flyers in Chinese Curtiss Hawk fighter planes to avoid stimulating enemy interest. However, weather conditions were so poor that after a number of hazardous and unsuccessful attempts, they were forced to postpone the project. Both planes were wrecked in the process. After the C-39 had failed in its mission, sometime between April 3rd and 6th, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek began to have severe misgivings about supporting the special project. On the 11th, he asked Colonel Bissell to inform Marshall that he wanted the project delayed until the end of May so that his ground forces could try to prevent Japanese occupation of the Chuchao area. Marshall replied the next day that he was unable to recall the special project since it was so imminent. He further affirmed that the planes would pass into Stilwell's permanent control after one landing for fuel. On the 13th, Hap Arnold also wired Chungking, saying that the first project could not be stopped because of its advanced stage. He added that, "We are depending upon your assistance as regards flares for landing and guidance and supplies for refueling." The Generalissimo was still not pacified, and on the 14th, Bissell reiterated that special project requiring only one landing the Generalissimo wishes delayed. Bissell also noted that details on mission cannot be given to Generalissimo since they are not known. Here, Marshall immediately replied on the 15th and directed Stilwell to explain the timing and reasons for the first special mission to the Generalissimo. This message was followed up by Arnold on the 16th, in which it was again stated that no changes in plans or additional discussion of information feasible re-project at this late date. If Task Force 16 were carrying out its orders, Marshall knew that it was only a matter of hours before the B-25s would be winging their way to Japan. On the 18th, he sent a final message to Chungking directing that an atmosphere of total mystery will surround special project, Stilwell to deny any connection with project, in re to public information. No publicity desired for project. Desire Generalissimo to observe same policy. Report any information on results of project immediately to War Department. As soon as Halsey returned to Pearl Harbor from San Francisco, he conferred with Admiral Nimitz, and the final details of the forthcoming mission were conveyed to the planning staff. On April 7th, Nimitz approved Operation Plan No. 2042, which stated, "This force will conduct a bombing raid against the enemy objective specified in Annex C, which is being furnished Commander Task Force 16. Only. Besides the task force ships Halsey had arranged for, there were 2 more vessels which only Halsey knew about. 2 submarines were to maintain patrol stations beginning on April 15th as follows. United States ship Trout area bounded by latitudes 31 and 3130 north and longitudes 142.30 and 144.30 east. United States ship Thresher area bounded by latitudes 34.30 and 34.50 north and longitudes 142.30 and 144.30 east. The missions of the Trout and Thresher were to report to Nimitz via Commander Submarines, Pacific Fleet, and information of any enemy forces which might threaten Task Force 16. Halsey had been told that any and all surface ships and submarines he would sight west of the rendezvous point could be presumed unfriendly. During the month of April, all United States subs proceeding to and from patrol stations would not be routed north of latitude 30 north. On April 8th, Halsey, flying his flag from the carrier Enterprise, steamed out through the submarine nets at Pearl Harbor and headed northwest. The heavy cruisers Northampton and Salt Lake City ploughed obediently alongside while the destroyers Bulch, Benham, Ellet and Fanning fanned out in protecting positions. The oiler Sabine, slowest ship in the force, set the pace and trailed behind the Big E. During the 5 days that the Enterprise and her protectors were steaming northwestward, Mitcher and his ships were having their troubles as they marked time to delay reaching the rendezvous point. The weather was foul with high winds, heavy seas, rain squalls and poor visibility. The high winds loosened the cables holding the B-25s on the Hornet's slippery deck and induced severe vibrations into their control surfaces. On the 9th, Mitcher signaled for the Cimarron to refuel the Hornet, but the swells were so hazardous it was impossible. 2 men were thrown overboard from the Cimarron, and refueling operations were discontinued. It was not until the 12th that the Cimarron could resume her task. On the morning of April 13th, the 2 task forces merged at the rendezvous point of 38 degrees, north own 180 degrees. The 16 ships maneuvered to take up their cruising stations, and when all were in position, Task Force 16 steamed due west at a speed of 16 knots. As the days dragged on, the B-25s were being continually checked over by their crews. Various minor difficulties developed. Generator failures, spark plug changes, leaky gas tanks and hydraulic system troubles plagued the B-25s. The Hornet maintenance shops below decks were kept busy repairing and replacing parts brought to them by the B-25 flight engineers. While the 16 ships had been plunging toward their rendezvous, the American garrison on Bataan was fighting its last. On April 9th, Bataan was surrendered, but General Jonathan Wainwright and 35,000 of his troops had escaped to Corregidor for a last-ditch stand. The whole world knew then that the Americans were doomed. For all practical purposes, the fall of Bataan had ended formal resistance on Luzon. The next day, April 10th, thousands of American and Filipino soldiers began a series of forced marches which historians were to refer to ever after as the Bataan Death March. American history would never record a darker period. The war news had been so consistently good for the Japanese by April that they had become complacent. Their defenses against ground invasion were inadequate. In fact, they never seriously considered there might be an invasion of Japan because it had become a national myth that the homeland was divinely protected. In 1281, Kublai Khan had organized a mighty Mongol armada to invade and conquer the Japanese islands. A great typhoon destroyed or dispersed the Mongol ships, and from that time on, the Japanese credited the kamikaze, the divine wind, with their salvation. The Japanese military planners were more practical in their thinking about air defense, however. At a meeting of military councillors on November 4, 1941, Premier Tojo made the following reply to a question asked by Admiral Hyakutake regarding their defences against attack from the air. I do not think the enemy could raid Japan proper from the air immediately after the outbreak of hostilities. Some time would elapse before the enemy could attempt such raids. I believe that enemy air attacks against Japan proper in the early stages of the war would be infrequent and would be carried out by carrier-based planes. If it should become possible for the enemy to raid Japan from bases in the Soviet Union, we might face considerable danger, but I think that this is not likely in the early stages of the war. Tojo was correct in his estimate, but he miscalculated one vital point. He was counting on American carrier-based planes with a range of only 300 miles, which would have to return to a carrier. Not a single Japanese intelligence officer would have ever believed that the B-25s lashed to the Hornet's flight deck could fly from that deck much less carry a bomb load of any size and make a flight of 2,000 miles or more. While Japanese intelligence was weak in its estimates of American ingenuity, it was strong in its ability to intercept and deduce from radio messages what the American Navy was doing. At 6:30 a.m. on April 10th, the Combined Fleet Radio Intelligence Unit heard radio messages being flashed between the Halsey and Mitchell forces and Pearl Harbor. Their radio experts deduced that an American task force built around 2 or 3 carriers was located in the vicinity of latitude 28 degrees north and longitude 164 degrees east. One Japanese historian described the reaction in the Combined Fleet headquarters when the intelligence report was delivered. Under mounting tension, the Combined Fleet made accurate calculations. If the enemy were to proceed westward, Tokyo would be attacked from the air around the 14th, because even if the carriers came at full speed, they would have to approach within 300 miles of the home islands in order to fly the planes they carried. However, our surveillance net was 700 nautical miles offshore, and the enemy, in order to break through this net and penetrate 300 nautical miles inward, would require 15 or 16 hours, so it would be possible for us to attack the enemy at our leisure the day before he launched his planes. American intelligence did not know of the line of Japanese picket ships forming the early warning surveillance net. In spite of the many forays by submarines into Japanese waters, the fact that a line of 100 to 300-ton fishing trawlers was being maintained on station had escaped their notice. Japanese radar had a very limited capability of detecting planes, and the air raid warning system was, therefore, mainly dependent on visual observation on land by military and civilian observers. The Japanese Navy had added to this system by stationing about 50 of these radio-equipped patrol boats 600 to 700 miles offshore. The state of Japanese air defenses was also an unknown factor. The air defense of Japan was conceived as a joint effort of the Army and Navy, with the air arms of both services being most vitally concerned. Although an actual ground invasion of Japan was not seriously considered, it was recognized that small-scale retaliatory air raids, launched for political or morale purposes, might well be an inevitable consequence of the outbreak of war. Emphasis was, therefore, laid on preparing an air defense system which would frustrate such raids and discourage their continuance. Local defense of cities against sporadic or occasional air raids was to be accomplished by land-based fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. Army and Navy bombers would cooperate in striking at the source by attacking enemy carriers and in knocking out air bases which might be established in China. The Doolittle raiders, unknowingly, were sailing into the enemy homeland, where the land-based air defense strength consisted of approximately 375mm anti-aircraft artillery pieces and about 100 Type 97 single-engine fighters. Compared with the Japanese forces in the overseas areas, the air defense units in the home islands were poorly equipped and trained. Nevertheless, if properly alerted and ready, this was still formidable opposition for 16 lightly armed medium bombers. On the 10th, when the radio intelligence reports were received, Vice Admiral Matoi Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Japanese Combined Fleet, immediately assessed the naval air forces available to meet the American task force, estimated to arrive within flying distance on the 14th. The immediate naval strength consisted of the 1st Fleet in the Inland Sea and the 2nd Fleet, which was heading home from the Indian Ocean, and would not reach Japan until the 18th, too late to engage the Americans. However, the 26th Air Flotilla, with its 69 bombing and scouting planes, could augment the home defenses. Ugaki and Vice Admiral Seigo Yamagata, commander of the 26th Air Flotilla, agreed on the plan of attack. When the American carriers were within 600 miles of land, the first bombers would be dispatched. If any carriers remained after this attack, a sustained torpedo attack would be made early the next morning. If successful, they estimated that American carrier strength in the Pacific would then be completely wiped out. The intelligence staff was discouraged when no more radio messages were intercepted and the American carriers were not sighted on the 14th. Either their radio intelligence system was unreliable, or the Americans had slipped away and headed off in another direction. However, until it was known where the Americans were, preparations against a raid would continue. Halsey's Task Force 16 steamed westward uneventfully on its course from the 13th to the 17th. Except during very poor weather, planes from the Enterprise maintained continuous inner and intermediate air patrols during daylight hours when weather permitted. Search flights were made at dawn and dusk up to 200 miles in an arc of 60 degrees off each bow. During the afternoon of the 15th, Halsey sent a message to the other ships. Intention fuel, heavy ships 1,000 miles, to westward X, thence carriers and cruisers, to point 500 miles, east of Tokyo launch Army bombers on Hornet for attack X, DDs and tankers remain vicinity fueling point rejoin on. Retirement X. Further operations as developments dictate. Each passing hour was now more fraught with danger. The tenseness was evident everywhere. It could be felt in the wardroom, the crew's mess, on the bridge, and in the engine room. How close to Japan could they go without being spotted? No one knew. To add to the uncertainty was an English-speaking radio news program originating in Tokyo. Reuters, British news agency, has announced that 3 American bombers have dropped bombs on Tokyo. This is a most laughable story. They know it is absolutely impossible for enemy bombers to get within 500 miles of Tokyo. Instead of worrying about such foolish things, the Japanese people are enjoying the fine spring sunshine and the fragrance of cherry blossoms. The log of the Enterprise for April 16th shows the increasing tension as Task Force 16 ploughed into enemy-dominated waters. Activity increased the next day. At 5:37 a.m., the Enterprise launched 18 scout bombers for 3-hour search missions. During the morning, the Sabine pumped aviation gasoline and fuel oil aboard the Big E, and then, along with the Cimarron, topped off the cruisers and destroyers. At 2:45 p.m., the destroyer Monson and both tankers left the formation to await the return of the larger ships after the B-25s were launched. A short time later, the other destroyers were detached. The 2 carriers and 4 cruisers left now increased their speeds to 20 knots. Hardly had the destroyers and tankers receded from view when the wind picked up and increased to gale force. Meanwhile, the B-25s had been spotted on the deck for takeoff. The lead bomber, Doolittle's, had 467 feet of clear deck. The last one, Lieutenant Bill Farrow's, hung precariously out over the stern ramp of the carrier. 2 white lines were painted on the deck-own for the left wheel, and 1 for the nose wheel of the bombers. If the pilots kept their plane on these lines, they could be assured of clearing the carrier's island with their right wings by about 6 feet. The excitement aboard the Hornet increased when its refueling was completed and the Mitchells positioned. Up on the bridge of the Hornet, Mitcher and Doolittle huddled over a map table. "Jimmy, we are in the enemy's backyard now," Mitcher said calmly. "Anything could happen from here on in. I think it is time for our little ceremony." Doolittle agreed. He had not yet read the messages to the group that he had received from Marshall and Arnold, and he wanted to do this. When the Enterprise had merged with the Hornet's force, mail had been exchanged, and Mitcher had received some official correspondence from the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox.